Oh, hello, and welcome back to Baby Alice's Stories. We now return to Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm by Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 18. Rebecca represents the family. There was another milestone. It was more than that. It was an event. An event that made a deep impression in several quarters and left a wake of smaller events in its train. This was the coming to Riverboro of the Reverend Amos Birch and wife, returned missionaries from Syria. The Aid Society had called its meeting for a certain Wednesday in March of the year in which Rebecca ended her Riverboro school days and began her studies at Wareham. It was a raw, blustering day, snow on the ground, and a look in the sky of more to follow. Both Miranda and Jane had taken cold and decided that they could not leave the house in such weather. And this deflection from the path of duty worried Miranda, since she was an officer of the society. After making the breakfast table sufficiently uncomfortable and wishing plaintively that Jane wouldn't always insist on being sick at the same time she was, she decided that Rebecca must go to the meeting in their stead. "You'll be better than nobody, Rebecca," she said flatteringly. "Your Aunt Jane shall write an excuse from afternoon school for you. You can wear your rubber boots and come home by the way of the meeting house. This Mr. Birch, if I remember right, used to know your grandfather Sawyer, and stayed here once when he was a candidating. He'll maybe look for us there, and you must just go and represent the family and give him our respects. Be careful how you behave. Bow your head in prayer. Sing all the hymns, but not too loud and bold. Ask after Miss Strout's boy. Tell everybody what awful colds we've got. If you see a good chance, take your pocket handkerchief and wipe the dust off the melodeon before the meeting begins. And get 25 cents out of the sitting room matchbox in case there should be a collection." Rebecca willingly assented. Anything interested her, even a village missionary meeting, and the idea of representing the family was rather intoxicating. The service was held in the Sunday school room, and although the Reverend Mr. Birch was on the platform when Rebecca entered, there were only a dozen persons present. Feeling a little shy and considerably too young for this assemblage, Rebecca sought the shelter of a friendly face, and seeing Mrs. Robinson in one of the side seats near the front, she walked up the aisle and sat beside her. "Both my aunts had bad colds," she said softly, "and sent me to represent the family." "That's Mrs. Birch on the platform with her husband," whispered Mrs. Robinson. "She's awful tanned up, ain't she? If you're going to save souls, seems like you have to part with your complexion. Your Doxy Morton ain't come yet. I hope to the land she will, or Miss Deacon Milliken'll pitch the tunes where we can't reach 'em with a ladder. Can't you pitch, afore she gets her breath and clears her throat?" Mrs. Birch was a slim, frail little woman, with dark hair and broad, low forehead and patient mouth. She was dressed in a well-worn black silk and looked so tired that Rebecca's heart went out to her. "They're poor as Job's turkey," whispered Mrs. Robinson. "But if you give 'em anything, they turn right around and give it to the heathen. His congregation up to Parsonsfield club together and give him that gold watch he carries. I suppose he'd have handed that over too. Only heathens always tell time by the sun and don't need watches. Your doctor ain't coming, now for massy's sake. Rebecca, do get ahead of Miss Deacon Milliken and pitch real low." The meeting began with prayer, and then the Reverend Mr. Birch announced, to the tune of Mendon, "Church of our God, I arise and shine, bright with the beams of truth divine. Then shall thy radiance stream afar, wide as the heathen nations are. Gentiles and kings thy light shall view, and shall admire and love thee too. They come like clouds across the sky, as doves that to their windows fly. Is there anyone present who will assist us at the instrument?" he asked unexpectedly. Everybody looked at everybody else, and nobody moved. Then there came a voice out of a far corner saying informally, "Rebecca, why don't you?" It was Mrs. Cobb. Rebecca could have played Mendon in the dark, so she went to the melodeon and did so without any ado, no member of her family being present to give her self-consciousness. The talk that ensued was much the usual sort of thing. Mr. Birch made impassioned appeals for the spreading of the gospel, and added his entreaties that all who were prevented from visiting in person the peoples who sat in darkness could contribute liberally to the support of others who could. But he did more than this. He was a pleasant, earnest speaker, and he interwove his discourse with stories of life in a foreign land, of the manners, the customs, the speech, the point of view, even giving glimpses of the daily round, the common task of his own household, the work of his devoted helpmate, and their little group of children, all born under Syrian skies. Rebecca sat entranced, having been given the key of another world. Riverboro had faded. The Sunday school room with Mrs. Robinson's red plaid shawl and Deacon Milliken's wig on crooked, and bare benches and torn hymn books, the hanging texts and maps were no longer visible. And she saw blue skies and burning stars, white turbans and gay colors. Mr. Birch had not said so, but perhaps there were mosques and temples and minarets and date palms. What stories they must know, those children born under the Syrian skies. Then she was called upon to play "Jesus Shall Reign Where'er the Sun." The contribution box was passed, and Mr. Birch prayed. As he opened his eyes and gave out the last hymn, he looked at the handful of people, at the scattered pennies and dimes in the contribution box, and reflected that his mission was not only to gather funds for the building of his church, but to keep alive, in all these remote and lonely neighborhoods, that love for the cause which was its only hope in the years to come. "If any of the sisters will provide entertainment," he said. Mrs. Birch and I will remain among you tonight and tomorrow. In that event, we could hold a parlor meeting. My wife and one of my children would wear the native costume. We would display some specimens of Syrian handiwork and give an account of our educational methods with the children. These informal parlor meetings, admitting of questions or conversation, are often the means of interesting those not commonly found at church services. So I repeat, if any member of the congregation desires it and offers her hospitality, we will gladly stay and tell you more of the Lord's work. A pall of silence settled over the little assembly. There was some cogent reason why every sister there was declined for company. Some had no spare room. Some had a larder less well stocked than usual. Some had sickness in the family. Some were unequally yoked together with unbelievers who disliked strange ministers. Mrs. Birch's thin hands fingered her black silk nervously. Would no one speak? Thought Rebecca, her heart fluttering with sympathy. Mrs. Robinson leaned over and whispered significantly. The missionaries always used to be entertained at the brick house. Your grandfather never would let 'em sleep anywhere else when he was alive. She meant this for a stab at Miss Miranda's parsimony. Remembering the 4 spare chambers, closed from January to December, but Rebecca thought it was intended as a suggestion. If it had been a former custom, perhaps her aunts would want her to do the right thing. For what else was she representing the family? So delighted that duty lay in so pleasant a direction, she rose from her seat and said in the pretty voice, with the quaint manner so separated her, from all the other young people in the village. My aunts, Miss Miranda and Miss Jane Sawyer, would be very happy to have you visit them at the brick house, as the ministers always used to do when their father was alive. They sent their respects by me. The respects might have been the freedom of the city or an equestrian statue when presented in this way. And the aunts would have shuddered could they have foreseen the manner of delivery. But it was vastly impressive to the audience, who concluded that Miranda Sawyer must be making her way uncommonly fast to mansions in the skies. Else what meant this abrupt change of heart? Mr. Birch bowed courteously, accepted the invitation. In the same spirit in which it was offered, and asked Brother Milliken to lead in prayer. If the eternal ear could ever tire, it would have ceased long ere If the eternal ear could ever tire, it would have ceased long ere this to listen to Deacon Milliken, who had wafted to the throne of grace the same prayer, with very slight variations, for 40 years. Mrs. Perkins followed. She had several petitions at her command, good, sincere ones too, but a little cut and dried, made of scripture texts, laboriously woven together. Rebecca wondered why she always ended at the most peaceful seasons with the form, "Do thou be with us, God of battles, while we strive onward like Christian soldiers marching as to war." But everything sounded real to her today. She was in a devout mood, and many things Mr. Birch had said had moved her strangely. As she lifted her head, the minister looked directly at her and said, Will our young sister close the service by leading us in prayer? Every drop of blood in Rebecca's body seemed to stand still, and her heart almost stopped beating. Mrs. Cobb's excited breathing could be heard distinctly in the silence. There was nothing extraordinary in Mr. Birch's request. In his journeyings among country congregations, he was constantly in the habit of meeting young members who had experienced religion and joined the church when 9 or 10 years old. Rebecca was now 13. She had played the melodeon, led the singing, delivered her aunt's invitation with an air of great worldly wisdom, and he, concluding that she must be a youthful pillar of the church, called upon her with the utmost simplicity. Rebecca's plight was pathetic. How could she refuse? How could she explain she was not a member? How could she pray before all those elderly women? John Rogers at the stake hardly suffered more than this poor child for the moment she rose to her feet, forgetting that ladies prayed sitting, while Deacon stood in prayer. Her mind was a maze of pictures that the Reverend Mr. Birch had flung on the screen. She knew the conventional phraseology, of course. What New England child accustomed to Wednesday evening meetings does not? But her own secret prayers were different. However, she began slowly and tremulously. Our Father, who art in heaven, thou art God in Syria just the same as in Maine. Over there today are blue skies and yellow stars and burning suns. The great trees are waving in the warm air, while here the snow lies thick under our feet. But no distance is too far for God to travel, and so He is with us here as He is with them there, and our thoughts rise to Him as doves that to their windows fly. We cannot all be missionaries, teaching people to be good. Some of us have not learned yet how to be good ourselves, but if thy kingdom is to come and thy will is to be done on earth as it is in heaven, everybody must try and everybody must help. Those who are old and tired and those who are young and strong, the little children of whom we have heard. Those born under Syrian skies have strange and interesting work to do for thee. And some of us would like to travel in far lands and do wonderful brave things for the heathen and gently take away their idols of wood and stone. But perhaps we have to stay at home and do what is given us to do. Sometimes even things we dislike. But that must be what it means in the hymn we sang when it talked about the sweet perfume that rises with every morning sacrifice. This is the way that God teaches us to be meek and patient, and the thought that He has willed it so should rob us of our fears and help us bear the years. Amen. Poor little ignorant, fantastic child. Her petition was simply a succession of lines from the various hymns and images the minister had caused in his sermon. But she had her own way of recombining and applying these things, even of using them in new connection, so that they had a curious effect of belonging to her. The words of some people might generally be written with a minus sign after them. The minus being that the personality of the speaker subtracted from rather than added to. The minus meaning that the personality of the speaker subtracted from rather than added to their weight, but Rebecca's words might always have borne the plus sign. The Amen said she sat down, or presumed she sat down, on what she believed to be a bench. And there was a benediction. In a moment or two, when the room ceased spinning, she went up to Mrs. Birch, who kissed her affectionately and said, "My dear, how glad I am that we are going to stay with you. Will 5:30 be too late for us to come? It is 3 now, and we have to go to the station for our valise and for our children. We left them there, being uncertain whether we should go back or stop here." Rebecca said that 5:30 was their supper hour, and then accepted an invitation to drive home with Mrs. Cobb. Her face was flushed, and her lip quivered in a way that Aunt Sarah had learned to know. So the homeward drive was taken almost in silence. The bleak wind and Aunt Sarah's quieting presence brought her back to herself, however, and she entered the brick house cheerily. Being too full of news to wait in the side entry to take off her rubber boots, she carefully lifted a braided rug into the sitting room and stood on that while she opened her budget. "There are your shoes warming by the fire," said Aunt Jane. "Slip them right on while you talk." Chapter 19. The Deacon, Israel's Successor. "It was a very small meeting, Aunt Miranda," began Rebecca, "and the missionary and his wife are lovely people, and they are coming here to stay all night and tomorrow with you. I hope you won't mind." "Coming here?" exclaimed Miranda, letting her knitting fall in her lap and taking her spectacles off, as she always did in moments of extreme excitement. "Did they invite themselves?" "No," Rebecca answered. "I had to invite them for you, but I thought you'd like to have such interesting company. It was this way." "Stop your explaining, and tell me first when they'll be here. Right away?" "No, not for 2 hours, about 5:30. "Then you can explain if you can. Who gave you any authority to invite a parcel of strangers to stop here overnight when you know we ain't had any company for 20 years and don't intend to have any for another 20, or at any rate while I'm the head of the house?" "Don't blame her, Miranda, till you've heard her story," said Jane. "It was in my mind right along if we went to the meeting, some such thing might happen on account of Mr. Birch knowing father." "The meeting was a small one," began Rebecca. "I gave all your messages, and everybody was disappointed you couldn't come, for the president wasn't there, and Mrs. Matthews took the chair, which was a pity, for the seat wasn't nearly big enough for her, and she reminded me of a line in a hymn we sang. "Wide as the heathen nations are." And she wore that kind of a beaver garden hat that always gets on one side. And Mr. Birch talked beautifully about the Syrian heathen, and the singing went real well. And there looked to be about 40 cents in the basket that was passed on our side. And that wouldn't save even a heathen baby, would it? Then Mr. Birch said if any sister would offer entertainment, they would pass the night and have a parlor meeting in Riverboro tomorrow with Mrs. Birch in Syrian costume and lovely foreign things to show. Then he waited, and nobody said a word. I was so mortified I didn't know what to do. And then he repeated what he said and explained why he wanted to stay, and you could see he thought it was his duty. Just then, Mrs. Robinson whispered to me and said the missionaries always used to go to the brick house when grandfather was alive, and that he never would let them sleep anywhere else. I didn't know you had stopped having them because no traveling ministers have been here except just for a Sunday morning since I came to Riverboro. So I thought I ought to invite them as you weren't there to do it for yourself and you told me to represent the family." "What did you do? Go up and introduce yourself as folks was going out?" "No, I stood right up in meeting. I had to, for Mrs. Birch's feelings were getting hurt at nobody's speaking. So I said, my aunts, Miss Miranda and Miss Jane Sawyer, would be happy to have you visit at the brick house, just as the missionaries always did when their father was alive. And they sent their respects by me. Then I sat down and Mr. Birch prayed for grandfather and called him a man of God and thanked our Heavenly Father that his spirit was still alive in his descendants, that was you, and that the good old house where so many of the brethren had been cheered and helped, and from which so many had gone out strengthened for the fight, was still hospitably open for the stranger and wayfarer. Sometimes, when the heavenly bodies are in just the right conjunction, nature seems to be the most perfect art. The word or the deed coming straight from the heart, without any thought of effect, seems inspired. A certain gateway in Miranda Sawyer's soul had been closed for years. Not all at once had it been done, but gradually, and without her full knowledge. If Rebecca had plotted for days, and with the utmost cunning, she could not have effected an entrance into that forbidden country. And now, unknown to both of them, the gate swung on its stiff and rusty hinges, and the favoring wind of opportunity opened it wider and wider as time went on. All things had worked together amazingly for good. The memory of old days had been evoked, and the daily life of a pious and venerated father called to mind. The Sawyer name had been publicly dignified and praised. Rebecca had comported herself as the granddaughter of Deacon Israel Sawyer should, and showed conclusively that she was not all Randall as had been supposed. Miranda was rather mollified by and pleased with the turn of events, although she did not intend to show it or give anybody any reason to expect that this expression of hospitality was to serve for a precedent on any subsequent occasion. "Well, I see you did only what you was obliged to do, Rebecca," she said, "and you worded your invitation as nice as anybody could have done. I wish your Aunt Jane and me wasn't both so worthless with these coals. But it only shows the good of having a clean house, with every room in order, whether open or shut, and enough victuals cooked you can't be surprised and belittled by anybody, whatever happens. There was half a dozen there that might have entertained the Birches as easy as not, if they hadn't of being too mean or lazy. Why didn't your missionaries come right along with you?" "They had to go to the station for their valleys and their children." "Are their children?" groaned Miranda. "Yes, Aunt Miranda, all born under Syrian skies." "Syrian grandmother?" ejaculated Miranda, and it was not a fact. "How many?" "I didn't think to ask, but I will get 2 rooms ready, and if there are any over, I'll take 'em into my bed," said Rebecca, secretly hoping that this would be the case. "Now, as you're both half sick, couldn't you trust me just once to get ready for the company? You can come up when I call, will you?" "I believe I will," sighed Miranda reluctantly. I'll lay down side of Jane in our bedroom and see if I can get strength to cook supper. It's 3:30. Don't you let me lay a minute past 5. I keep a good fire in the kitchen stove. I don't know, I'm sure, why I should have baked a pot of beans in the middle of the week, but they'll come in handy. Father used to say there was nothing that went right to the spot with returned missionaries like pork and beans and brown bread. Fix up the 2 south chambers, Rebecca. Rebecca gave a free hand for the only time in her life, dashed upstairs like a whirlwind. Every room in the brick house was as neat as wax, and she had only to pull up the shades, go over the floors with a whisk broom, and dust the furniture. The aunts could hear her scurrying to and fro, beating up pillows and feather beds, flapping towels, jingling crockery, singing meanwhile in her clear voice. In vain, with lavish kindness, the gifts of God are strown. The heathen in his blindness bows down to wood and stone. She had grown to be a handy little creature, and tasks she was capable of doing at all she did like a flash, so that when she called her aunts at 5 o'clock to pass judgment, she had accomplished wonders. There were fresh towels on bureaus and washstands. The beds were fair and smooth. The pitchers were filled, and soap and matches were laid out. Newspaper, kindling, and wood were in the boxes, and a large stick burned slowly in each airtight stove. I thought I'd better just take the chill off, she explained, as they're right from Syria. That reminds me, I must look it up in the geography before they get here. There was nothing to disapprove, so the 2 sisters went downstairs to make some slight changes in their dress. As they passed the parlor door, Miranda thought she heard a crackle and looked in. The shades were up, there was a cheerful blaze in the open stove in the front parlor, and a fire laid on the hearth in the back room. Rebecca's own lamp, the second Christmas present for Mr. Aladdin, stood on a marble-top table in the corner. The light that came softly through its rose-colored shade, transforming the stiff and gloomy ugliness of the room into a place where one could sit and love one's neighbor. "For mercy's sake, Rebecca," called Miss Miranda up the stairs. "Did you think we'd better open the parlor?" Rebecca came out on the landing, braiding her hair. "We did on Thanksgiving and Christmas, and I thought this was about as great an occasion," she said. "I moved the wax flowers off the mantelpiece so they wouldn't melt, and put the shells, the coral, and the green stuffed bird on the top of the whatnot so the children wouldn't ask to play with them. Brother Milliken's coming over to see Mr. Birch about business, and I shouldn't wonder if Brother and Sister Cobb happened in. Don't go down cellar. I'll be there in a minute to do the running." Miranda and Jane exchanged glances. "Ain't she the beatenest creature that ever was born into the world?" exclaimed Miranda. "But she can turn off work when she's got a mind to." At 5:15, everything was ready, and the neighbors, those at least who were within the sight of the brick house, a prominent object in the landscape when there were no leaves on the trees, were curious almost to desperation. Shades up in both parlors, shades up in the 2 south bedrooms, and fires, if human vision was to be relied on, fires in about every room. If it had not been for the kind offices of a lady who had been at the meeting, and who had charitably called in at 1 or 2 houses and explained the reason of all this preparation, there would have been no sleep in many families. The missionary party arrived promptly, and there were but 2 children, 7 or 8, having been left with the brethren in Portland to diminish traveling expenses. Jane escorted them all upstairs while Miranda watched the cooking of the supper. But Rebecca promptly took the 2 little girls away from their mother, divested them of their wraps, smoothed their hair, and brought them down to the kitchen to smell the beans. This was a bountiful supper, and the presence of the young people robbed it of all possible stiffness. Aunt Jane helped clear the table and put away the food while Miranda entertained in the parlor, but Rebecca and the infant Birches washed the dishes and held high carnival in the kitchen, doing only trifling damage, breaking a cup and plate that had been cracked before, emptying a silver spoon with some dishwater out of the back door, an act never permitted at the brick house, and putting coffee grounds in the sink. All evidences of crime having been removed by Rebecca, and damages repaired in all possible cases, the 3 entered the parlor, where Mr. and Mrs. Cobb and Deacon and Mrs. Milliken had already appeared. It was such a pleasant evening. Occasionally, they left the heathen in his blindness bowing down to wood and stone, not for long, but just to give themselves and him time enough to breathe. And then the Birches told strange, beautiful, marvelous things. The 2 smaller children sang together, and Rebecca, at the urgent request of Mrs. Birch, seated herself at the tinkling old piano and gave Wild Roved an Indian Girl, Bright Alpharetta, with considerable spirit and style. At 8 o'clock, she crossed the room, handed a palm leaf fan to her Aunt Miranda, ostensibly that she might shade her eyes from the lamplight, but it was a piece of strategy that gave her an opportunity to whisper, "How about cookies?" "Do you think it's worthwhile?" sibilated Miss Miranda in answer. Sibilate, utter with a hissing sound. "Do you think it's worthwhile?" sibilated Miss Miranda in answer. "The Perkinses always do." "All right, you know where they be." Rebecca moved quietly towards the door, and the young Birches cataracted after her as if they could not bear a second separation. In 5 minutes they returned, the little ones bearing plates of thin caraway wafers. Hearts, diamonds, and circles, daintily sugared, and flecked with caraway seed raised in the garden behind the house. There was a speciality of Miss Jane's. These were a speciality of Miss Jane's. And Rebecca carried a tray with 6 tiny crystal glasses filled with dandelion wine, for which Miss Miranda had been famous in years gone by. Old Deacon Israel had always had it passed, and he had bought the glasses himself in Boston. Miranda admired them greatly, not only for their beauty, but because they held so little. Before their advent, the dandelion wine had been served in sherry glasses. As soon as these refreshments, commonly called a collation in Riverboro, had been genteelly partaken of, Rebecca looked at the clock, rose from her chair in the children's corner, and said cheerfully, "Come, time for little missionaries to be in bed." Everybody laughed at this, the big missionaries most of all, as the young people shook hands and disappeared with Rebecca. Chapter 20. A Change of Heart. That niece of yours is the most remarkable girl I have seen in years, said Mr. Birch when the door closed. She seems to be turning out smart enough lately, but she's considerable heedless, answered Miranda, and most too lively. We must remember that it is deficient, not excessive vitality, that makes the greatest trouble in this world, returned Mr. Birch. She'd make a wonderful missionary, said Mrs. Birch, with her voice and her magnetism and her gift of language. If I was to say which of the two she was best adapted for, I'd say she'd make a better heathen, remarked Miranda curtly. My sister don't believe in flattering children, hastily interpolated Jane, glancing toward Mrs. Birch, who seemed somewhat shocked, and was about to open her lips to ask if Rebecca was not a professor. Mrs. Cobb had been looking for this question all the evening, and dreading some allusion to her favorite as gifted in prayer. She had taken an instantaneous and illogical dislike to the Reverend Mr. Birch in the afternoon because he called upon Rebecca to lead. She had seen the pallor creep into the girl's face, the hunted look in her eyes, and the trembling of the lashes on her cheeks, and realized the ordeal through which she was passing. Her prejudice against the minister had relaxed under his genial talk and presence, but feeling that Mrs. Birch was about to tread on dangerous ground, she hastily asked her if one had to change cars many times going from Riverboro to Syria. She felt that it was not a particularly appropriate question, but it served her turn. Deacon Milliken, meantime, said to Miss Sawyer, Miranda, do you know who Rebecca reminds me of? I can guess pretty well, she replied. Then you've noticed it too. I thought at first, seeing she favored her father so on the outside, that she was the same all through. But she ain't. She's like your father, Israel Sawyer. I don't see how you make that out, said Miranda, thoroughly astonished. It struck me this afternoon when she got up to give your invitation in meeting. It was kinda curious, but she sat in the same seat he used to when he was leader of the Sabbath school. You know, his old way of holding his chin up and throwing his head back a little when he got up to say anything? Well, she done the very same thing. There was more than one spoke of it. The callers left before 9, and at the hour, and possibly dissipated one for the brick house. The family retired for the night. As Rebecca carried Mrs. Birch's candle upstairs and found herself thus alone with her for a minute, she said shyly, Will you please tell Mr. Birch that I'm not a member of the church? I didn't know what to do when he asked me to pray this afternoon. I hadn't the courage to say I had never done it out loud and didn't know how. I couldn't think, and I was so frightened I wanted to sink into the floor. It seemed bold and wicked for me to pray before all those church members and make believe I was better than I really was. But then again, wouldn't God think I was wicked not to be willing to pray when the minister asked me to? The candlelight fell on Rebecca's flushed, sensitive face. Mrs. Birch bent and kissed her good night. Don't be troubled, she said. I'll tell Mr. Birch, and I guess God will understand. Rebecca waked before 6 the next morning, so full of household cares that sleep was impossible. She went to the window and looked out. It was still dark and a blustering, boisterous day. Aunt Jane told me she could get up at 6:30 and have breakfast at 7:30, she thought. But I dare say they are both sick with their colds, and Aunt Miranda will be fidgety with so many in the house. I believe I'll creep down and start things for a surprise. She put on a wadded wrapper and slippers and stole quietly down the tabooed front stairs, carefully closed the kitchen door behind her so that no noise would waken the rest of the household, busied herself for half an hour with the early morning routine she knew so well, and then went back to her room to dress before calling the children. Contrary to expectation, Miss Jane, who the evening before felt better than Miranda, grew worse in the night and was wholly unable to leave her bed in the morning. Miranda grumbled without ceasing during the progress of her hasty toilet, blaming everybody in the universe for the afflictions she had borne and was to bear during the day. She even castigated the missionary board that had sent the Birches to Syria, and gave it as her unbiased opinion that those who went to foreign lands for the purpose of saving heathen should stay there and save him, and not go gallivanting all over the earth with a passel of children, visiting folks that didn't want him and never asked them. Jane lay anxiously and restlessly in bed with a feverish headache, wondering how her sister could manage without her. Miranda walked stiffly through the dining room, tying a shawl over her head to keep the draughts away, intending to start the breakfast fire and then call Rebecca down, set her to work, and tell her meanwhile a few plain facts concerning the proper way of representing the family at a missionary meeting. She opened the kitchen door and stared vaguely about her, wondering whether she had strayed into the wrong house by mistake. The shades were up, and there was a roaring fire in the stove. The tea kettle was singing and bubbling as it sent out a cloud of steam, and pushed over its capacious nose was a half sheet of note paper with compliments of Rebecca scrawled on it. The coffee pot was scalding. The coffee was measured out in a bowl, and broken eggshells for the settling process were standing near. The cold potatoes and corned beef were in the wooden tray, and regards of Rebecca stuck on the chopping knife. The brown loaf was out, the white loaf was out, the toast rack was out, the doughnuts were out, the milk was skimmed, the butter had been brought from the dairy. Miranda removed the shawl from her head and sank into the kitchen rocker, ejaculating under her breath, "She is the beatenest child. I declare she's all Sawyer." The day and the evening passed off with credit and honor to everybody concerned, even to Jane, who had the discretion to recover instead of growing worse and acting as a damper to the general enjoyment. The Birches left with lively regrets, and the little missionaries, bathed in tears, swore eternal friendship with Rebecca, who pressed into their hands at parting a poem composed before breakfast. To Mary and Martha Birch, born under Syrian skies, 'neath hotter suns than ours, the children grew and bloomed like little tropic flowers. When they first saw light, 'twas in a heathen land, not Greenland's icy mountains, nor India's coral strand, but some mysterious country where men are nearly black, and where of true religion there is a painful lack. Then let us haste in helping, the missionary board, see dark-skinned unbelievers, and teach them of their Lord. Rebecca Rowena Randall. It can readily be seen that this visit of the returned missionaries to Riverboro was not without somewhat far-reaching results. Mr. and Mrs. Birch themselves looked back upon it as one of the rarest pleasures of their half-year at home. The neighborhood extracted considerable eager conversation from it. Argument, rebuttal, suspicion, certainty, retrospect, and prophecy. Deacon Milliken gave $10 towards the conversion of Syria to Congregationalism, and Mrs. Milliken had a spell of sickness over her husband's rash generosity. It would be pleasant to state that Miranda Sawyer was an entirely changed woman afterwards, but that is not the fact. The tree that has been getting a twist for 20 years cannot be straightened in the twinkling of an eye. It is certain, however, that although the difference to the outward eye was very small, it nevertheless existed, and she was less censorious in her treatment of Rebecca, censorious in her treatment of Rebecca, less harsh in her judgments, more hopeful of final salvation for her. This had come about largely from her sudden vision that Rebecca, after all, inherited something from the Sawyer side of the house, instead of belonging mind, body, and soul to the despised Randall stock. Everything that was interesting in Rebecca, and every evidence of power, capability, or talent afterwards displayed by her, Miranda ascribed to the brick house training, and this gave her a feeling of honest pride, the pride of a master workman who has built success out of the most unpromising material. But never, to the very end, even when the waning of her bodily strength relaxed her iron grip and weakened her power of repression, never once did she show that pride or make a single demonstration of affection. Poor, misplaced, belittled Lorenzo de Medici Randall, thought ridiculous and good for naught by his associates, because he resembled them in nothing. If Riverboro could have been suddenly emptied into a larger community with different and more flexible opinions, he was perhaps the only personage in the entire population who would have attracted the smallest attention. It was fortunate for his daughter that she had been dowered with the little practical ability from her mother's family, but if Lorenzo had never done anything else in the world, he might have glorified himself that he had prevented Rebecca from being all Sawyer. Failure as he was, complete and entire, he had generously handed down to her all that was best in himself, and prudently retained all that was unworthy. Few fathers are capable of such delicate discrimination. The brick house did not speedily become a sort of wayside inn, a place of innocent revelry and joyous welcome. But the missionary company was an entering wedge, and Miranda allowed one spare bed to be made up in case anything should happen, while the crystal glasses were kept on the second from the top instead of the top shelf in the china closet. Rebecca had to stand on a chair to reach them. Now she could do it by stretching, and this is symbolic of the way in which she unconsciously scaled the walls of Miss Miranda's dogmatism and prejudice. Miranda went so far as to say that she wouldn't mind if the Birches came every once in a while, but she was afraid he'd spread abroad the fact of his visit, and missionaries' families would be underfoot the whole continual time. As a case in point, she gracefully cited the fact that if a tramp got a good meal at everybody's back door, 'twas 'Twas said that he'd leave some kind of a sign so that all other tramps would know where they were likely to receive the same treatment. It is to be feared that there is some truth in this homely illusion, and Miss Miranda's dread as to her future responsibilities had some foundation, though not of the precise sort she had in mind. The soul grows into lovely habits as easily as into ugly ones, and the moment a life begins to blossom into beautiful words and deeds, that moment a new standard of conduct is established, and your eager neighbors look to you for a continuous manifestation of the good cheer, the sympathy, the ready wit, the comradeship, or the inspiration you once showed yourself capable of. Bear figs for a season or two, and the world outside the orchard is very unwilling you should bear thistles. The effects of the Birch's visit on Rebecca is not easily described. Nevertheless, as she looked back upon it from the vantage ground or after years, she felt that the moment when Mr. Birch asked her to lead in prayer marked an epoch in her life. If you have ever observed how courteous and gracious and mannerly you feel when you don a beautiful new frock, if you have ever noticed the feeling of reverence stealing over you when you close your eyes, clasp your hands, and bow your head, if you ever watched your sense of repulsion toward a fellow creature melt a little under the exercise of daily politeness, you may understand how the adoption of the outward and visible sign has some strange influence in developing the inward and spiritual state of which it is the expression. It is only when one has grown old and dull that the soul is heavy and refuses to rise. The young soul is ever winged. A breath stirs it to an upward flight. Rebecca was asked to bear witness to a state of mind or feeling of those existence she had only the vaguest consciousness. She obeyed, and as she uttered words, they became true in their uttering. As she voiced aspirations, they settled into realities. As dove that to its window flies, her spirit soared towards a great light, dimly discovered at first, but brighter as she came closer to it, to become sensible of oneness with the divine heart before any sense of separation has been felt. This is surely the most beautiful way for the child to find God. Chapter 21. The sky line widens. The time so long and eagerly waited for had come, and Rebecca was a student at Wareham. Persons who had enjoyed the social bewilderment and advantages of foreign courts, or had mingled freely in the intellectual circles of great universities, might not have looked upon Wareham as an extraordinary experience. But it was as much of an advance upon Riverboro as that village had been upon Sunnybrook Farm. Rebecca's intentions was to complete the 4 years' course in 3, as it was felt by all the parties concerned that when she had attained the ripe age of 17, she must be ready to earn her own living and help in the education of the younger children. While she was wondering how this could be successfully accomplished, some of the other girls were cogitating. think deeply about something, meditate or reflect, cogitate, think about. Some of the other girls were cogitating as to how they could meander through the 4 years and come out at the end knowing no more than at the beginning. This would seem a difficult, well nigh an impossible task, but it can be achieved, and has been at other seats of learning than modest little Wareham. Rebecca was to go to and fro on the cars daily from September to Christmas, and then board in Wareham during the 3 coldest months. Emma Jane's parents had always thought that a year or 2 in the Edgewood High School, 3 miles from Riverboro, would serve every purpose for their daughter and send her into the world with as fine an intellectual polish as she could well sustain. Emma Jane had hitherto heartily concurred in this opinion, for if there was any one thing that she detested, it was the learning of lessons. One book was as bad as another in her eyes, and she could have seen the libraries of the world sinking into ocean depths and have eaten her dinner cheerfully the while. But matters assumed a different complexion when she was sent to Edgewood and Rebecca to Wareham. She bore it for a week, 7 endless days of absence from the beloved object, whom she could only see in the evenings when both were busy with their lessons. Sunday offered an opportunity to put the matter before her father, who proved obdurate. He didn't believe in education and thought she had full enough already. He never intended to keep up blacksmithing for good when he leased his farm and came into Riverboro, but proposed to go back to it presently, and by that time Emma Jane would have finished school and would be ready to help her mother with the dairy work. Another week passed. Emma Jane pined visibly and audibly. Her color faded, and her appetite at table dwindled almost to nothing. Her mother alluded plaintively to the fact that the Perkinses had a habit of going into declines, that she'd always feared that Emma Jane's complexion was too beautiful to be healthy, that some men would be proud of having an ambitious daughter and be glad to give her the best advantages, that she feared the daily journeys to Edgewood were going to be too much for her own health, and Mr. Perkins would have to hire a boy to drive Emma Jane. And finally, that when a girl had such a passion for learning as Emma Jane, it seemed almost like wickedness to cross her will. Mr. Perkins bore this for several days until his temper, digestion, and appetite were all sensibly affected. Then he bowed his head to the inevitable, and Emma Jane flew like a captive set free to the loved one's bower. Neither did her courage flag, although it was put to terrific tests when she entered the academic groves of Wareham. She passed in only 2 subjects, but went cheerfully into the preparatory department with her 5 conditions, intending to let the stream of education play gently over her mental surfaces and not get any wetter than she could help. It is not possible to blink the truth that Emma Jane was dull, but a dogged, unswerving loyalty and the gift of devoted, unselfish loving. These, after all, are talents of a sort, and may possibly be of as much value in the world as a sense of numbers or a faculty for languages. Wareham was a pretty village with a broad main street shaded by great maples and elms. It had an apothecary, a blacksmith, a plumber, several shops of one sort and another, 2 churches, and many boarding houses, but all its interests gathered about its seminary and its academy. These seats of learning were neither better nor worse than others of their kind, but differed much in efficiency. According as the principal who chanced to be at the head was a man of power and inspiration, or the reverse. There were boys and girls gathered from all parts of the county, and state, and they were of every kind and degree as to birth, position in the world, wealth, or poverty. There was an opportunity for a deal of foolish and imprudent behavior, but on the whole, surprisingly, little advantage was taken of it. Among the 3rd and 4th year students, there was a certain amount of going to and from the trains in couples, some carrying of heavy books up the hill by the sterner sex for their feminine schoolmates, and occasional bursts of silliness on the part of heedless and precocious girls, among whom was Huldah Meserve. She was friendly enough with Emma Jane and Rebecca, but grew less and less intimate as time went on. She was extremely pretty, with a profusion of auburn hair and a few very tiny freckles to which she constantly alluded, as no one could possibly detect them without noting her porcelain skin and her curling lashes. She had merry eyes, a somewhat too plump figure for her years, and was popularly supposed to have a fascinating way with her. Riverboro being poorly furnished with beaux, she intended to have as a good time during her 4 years at Wareham as circumstances would permit. Her idea of pleasure was an ever-changing circle of admirers to fetch and carry for her. The more publicly, the better. The incessant chaff and laughter and vivacious conversation made eloquent and effective by arch looks and telling glances. She had a habit of confiding her conquests to less fortunate girls and bewailing the incessant havoc and damage she was doing, a damage she avowed herself as innocent of, in intention as any newborn lamb. It does not take much of this sort of thing to wreck an ordinary friendship. So before long, Rebecca and Emma Jane sat in one end of the railway train and going to and from Riverboro, and Huldah occupied the other with her court. Sometimes this was brilliant beyond words, including a certain youthful Monte Cristo, who on Fridays expended 30 cents on a round-trip ticket and traveled from Wareham to Riverboro merely to be near Huldah. Sometimes, too, the circle was reduced to the popcorn and peanut boy of the train, who seemed to serve every purpose in default of better game. Rebecca was in the normally unconscious state that belonged to her years. Boys were good comrades, but no more. She liked reciting in the same class with them. Everything seemed to move better, but from vulgar and precocious flirtations, she was protected by her ideals. There was little in the lads she had met thus far to awaken her fancy, for it habitually fed on better meat. Huldah's schoolgirl romances, with their wealth of commonplace detail, were not the stuff her dreams were made of, when dreams did flutter across the sensitive plate of her mind. Among the teachers at Wareham was one who influenced Rebecca profoundly, Miss Emily Maxwell, with whom she studied English literature and composition. Miss Maxwell, as the niece of one of Maine's ex-governors and the daughter of one of Bowdoin's professors, was the most remarkable personality in Wareham, and that her few years of teaching happened to be in Rebecca's time was the happiest of all chances. There was no indecision or delay in the establishment of their relations. Rebecca's heart flew like an arrow to its mark, and her mind, meeting its superior, settled at once into an abiding attitude of respectful homage. It was rumored that Miss Maxwell wrote, which word, when uttered in a certain tone, was understood to mean not that a person had command of penmanship, Spencerian or otherwise, but that she had appeared in print. "You'll like her. She rides," whispered Huldah to Rebecca the first morning at prayers, where the faculty sat in an imposing row on the front seats. "She rides, and I call her stuck up." Nobody seemed possessed of exact information with which to satisfy the hungry mind, but there was believed to be at least one person in existence who had seen with his own eyes an essay by Miss Maxwell in a magazine. This height of achievement made Rebecca somewhat shy of her, but she looked her admiration, something that most of the class could never do with the unsatisfactory organs of vision given them by Mother Nature. Miss Maxwell's glance was always meeting a pair of eager dark eyes. When she said anything particularly good, she looked for approval to the corner of the second bench, where every shade of feeling she wished to evoke was reflected on a certain sensitive young face. One day, when the first essay of the class was under discussion, she asked each new pupil to bring her some composition written during the year before, that she might judge the work and know precisely with what material she had to deal. Rebecca lingered after the others and approached the desk shyly. "I haven't any compositions here, Miss Maxwell, but I can find one when I go home on Friday. They are packed away in a box in the attic." "Carefully tied with pink and blue ribbons?" asked Miss Maxwell with a whimsical smile. "No," answered Rebecca, shaking her head decidedly. "I wanted to use ribbons because all the other girls did, and they looked so pretty. But I used to tie my essays with twine strings on purpose, and the one on solitude I fastened with an old shoe lacing just to show it what I thought of it." "Solitude?" laughed Miss Maxwell, raising her eyebrows. "Did you choose your own subject?" "No, Miss Dearborn thought we were not old enough to find good ones." "What were some of the others?" "Fireside Reveries," "Grant as a Soldier," "Reflections on the Life of P.T. Barnum," "Buried Cities." I can't remember any more now. They were all bad, and I can't bear to show them. I can write poetry easier and better, Miss Maxwell." "Poetry?" she exclaimed. "Did Miss Dearborn require you to do it?" "Oh, no. I always did it even at the farm. Shall I bring all I have? It isn't much." Rebecca took the blank book in which she kept copies of her effusions and left it at Miss Maxwell's door, hoping that she might be asked in and thus obtain a private interview. But a servant answered her ring, and she could only walk away disappointed. A few days afterward, she saw the black-covered book on Miss Maxwell's desk and knew that the dreaded moment of criticism had come, so she was not surprised to be asked to remain after class. The room was quiet. The red leaves rustled in the breeze and flew in at the open window, bearing the first compliments of the season. Miss Maxwell came and sat by Rebecca's side on the bench. "Did you think these were good?" she asked, giving her the verses. Not so very, confessed Rebecca, but it's hard to tell all by yourself. The Perkinses and the Cobbs always said they were wonderful, but when Mrs. Cobb told me she thought they were better than Mr. Longfellow's, I was worried, because I knew that couldn't be true. This ingenious remark confirmed Miss Maxwell's opinion of Rebecca as a girl who could hear the truth and profit by it. Well, my child, she said smilingly, your friends were wrong, and you were right. Judged by the proper tests, they are pretty bad. Then I must give up all hope of ever being a writer, sighed Rebecca, who was tasting the bitterness of hemlock and wondering if she could keep the tears back until the interview was over. Don't go so fast, interrupted Miss Maxwell. Though they don't amount to anything as poetry, they show a good deal of promise in certain directions. You almost never make a mistake in rhyme or meter, and this shows you have a natural sense of what is right, a sense of form, poets would call it. When you grow older, have a little more experience, in fact, when you have something to say, I think you may write very good verses. Poetry needs knowledge and vision, experience and imagination, Rebecca. You have not the first three yet, but I rather think you have a touch of the last. Must I never try any more poetry, not even to amuse myself? Certainly you may. It will only help you to write better prose. Now for the first composition, I'm going to ask all the new students to write a letter giving some description of the town and a hint of the school life. Shall I have to be by myself? Asked Rebecca. What do you mean? A letter from Rebecca Randall to her sister Hannah at Sunnybrook Farm, or to her Aunt Jane at the brick house, Riverboro, is so dull and stupid if it is a real letter. But if I could make believe I was a different girl altogether and write to somebody who would be sure to understand everything I said, I could make it nicer. Very well, I think that's a delightful plan, said Miss Maxwell. And whom will you suppose yourself to be? I like heiresses very much, replied Rebecca contemplatively. Of course, I never saw one, but interesting things are always happening to heiresses, especially to the golden-haired kind. My heiress wouldn't be vain and haughty like the wicked sisters in Cinderella. She would be noble and generous. She would give up a grand school in Boston because she wanted to come here, where her father lived when he was a boy, long before he made his fortune. The father is dead now, and she has a guardian, the best and kindest man in the world. She is rather old, of course, and sometimes very quiet and grave, but sometimes when he is happy, he is full of fun. And then Evelyn is not afraid of him. Yes, the girl shall be called Evelyn Abercrombie, and her guardian's name shall be Mr. Adam Ladd. Do you know Mr. Ladd? Asked Miss Maxwell in surprise. Yes, he's my very best friend, cried Rebecca delightedly. Do you know him too? Oh, yes. He is a trustee of these schools, you know, and often comes here. But if I let you suppose any more, you will tell me your whole letter, and then I shall lose a pleasant surprise. What Rebecca thought of Miss Maxwell we already know. How the teacher regarded the pupil may be gathered from the following letter written 2 or 3 months later. Wareham, December 1st. My dear father, as you well know, I have not always been an enthusiast on the subject of teaching. The task of cramming knowledge into these self-sufficient, inefficient youngsters of both sexes discourages me at times. The more stupid they are, the less they are aware of it. If my department were geography or mathematics, I believe I should feel that I was accomplishing something. For in those branches, application and industry work wonders. For in those branches, application and industry work wonders. But in English literature and composition, one yearns for brains, for appreciation, for imagination. Month after month I toil on, opening oyster after oyster, but seldom finding a pearl. Fancy my joy this term, when without any violent effort at shell splitting, I came upon a rare pearl, a black one, but of satin skin and beautiful luster. Her name is Rebecca, and she looks not unlike Rebecca at the well in our family Bible. Her hair and eyes being so dark as to suggest a strain of Italian or Spanish blood. She is nobody in particular. Man has done nothing for her. She has no family to speak of, no money, no education worthy the name, has had no advantages of any sort. But Dame Nature flung herself into the breach and said, "This child I to myself will take. She shall be mine, and I will make a lady of my own." Bless Wordsworth, how he makes us understand, and the pearl never heard of him until now. Think of reading Lucy to a class, and when you finish, seeing a 14-year-old pair of lips quivering with delight, and a pair of eyes brimming with comprehending tears. You poor darling, you too know the discouragement of sowing lovely seed in rocky earth, in sand and water, and it almost seems sometimes in mud, knowing that if anything comes up at all, it will be some poor starveling plant. Fancy the joy of finding a real mine, of dropping seed in the soil so warm, so fertile, that one knows there are sure to be foliage, blossoms, and fruit all in good time. I wish I were not so impatient and so greedy of results. I am not fit to be a teacher. No one who is so scornful of stupidity as I am. The pearl writes quaint, contrified little verses. Doggerel they are, but somehow or other she always contrives to put in one line, one thought, one image that shows you she is, quite unconsciously to herself, in possession of the secret. Goodbye. I'll bring Rebecca home with me some Friday and let you and Mother see her for yourselves. Your affectionate daughter, Emily.